Ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome as we come to another one of our come together and talks here in St. Columkills, and I welcome you all with us, and it's a great honour for me to introduce Monica McWilliams. Thank you for being here. Monica, just a little bio on Monica, was co-founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, as you all know, a political party involved in the multi-party peace negotiations that led to the 1998 peace agreement. Monica was elected to the first Northern Ireland Legislative Assembly, representing South Belfast, and as Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission, she drafted the advice on a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. She currently serves as a Commissioner on the Independent Reporting Commissioner, overseeing the measures to end paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland. Must be fun. As Professor Emeritus at Ulster University, she recently published her memoir, Stand Up and Speak Out, charting her activism over the decades from the civil rights protests in the 1960s to the signing and implementing of the Good Friday Agreement. She is a recipient of the J.F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. Even beyond that, she is a woman who has stood up for women all of her days in many different ways, a voice that was crying out long before women's voices were really being heard. And for that, we've always upheld you in great esteem. You've been a personal friend of mine, going right back to when I first ended up meeting Monica with one of her cousins, Father Paddy McWilliams, back in 1975. It's a long time.
50 years.
50 years this year, indeed. So may I introduce to you all Monica McWilliams.
Thanks very much, Father Stephen. And one of the parts that Father Stephen didn't refer to is our work together for about the last 30 years in the prisons in Northern Ireland. I was the Oversight Commissioner for Prison Reform, but long before that, in my human rights role, I think it was through that work that we first met, when actually refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants were actually put into hide bank, and it was our job to see if we could get them their passports and get them back to wherever they needed to be. It's hard to believe, isn't it, how times have changed? But anyway, it's great to be here in Father Stephen's parish. I've been here many times. So if you know Father Stephen as well as I do, you'll know that he gave me a blank page. So I'm in your hands. I'm happy to talk about what it was like 26 years ago in the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement. How did an ordinary woman like me fall into extraordinary times like that? And of course, I had been involved in the civil rights movement. That definitely is dating me. There's a wonderful exhibition actually just opening next week in the Lynn Hall Library, where they've got all the documents all gathered together. Looking forward to seeing it, because a lot of that material has disappeared. But I started out then, and actually with my sister Mary, and I see my cousin Geraldine here, who's a parishioner here. Our first activism was for Biafra, when the parish said that there was a famine in Biafra, and as young people we gathered together in parish hall. It was a freezing cold night like tonight, and they hadn't given us any wood to light the fire, but there were some really rockety old chairs, so we split them up and lit the fire, and that's how we kept warm that night. I'm not sure that we gathered a lot of money, but it was my very first experience of understanding what it was like in Nigeria. The pictures were coming in on the television of people, and children in particular, starving, and we thought we would gather the money up. I think it was for Trócaire, and I see the Trócaire box there. I'm a volunteer with Trócaire, and I can talk about my work internationally with Trócaire. 2 years ago, at exactly this week past, I visited South Sudan with Trócaire, and with Concern. I'm now with Concern. I did 8 years with Trócaire on their board, and went to many places, to Burma, to Myanmar, up on the Chinese border with my sister, and we did some work with the 13 different ethnic tribes about what, and this was before the Tatana, the Burmese army, took over and declared the coup. We were there just on the verge of it, just as the Rohingya were being expelled from Burma. We were on the other side, and the Christian area, which is way up in the north, where we met incredible missionaries, actually, who had been expelled in the 1960s, but were now allowed back. And they were running the hospitals and the schools, as they do in many different places. Remember Sister Mary, the most incredible nurse that I've ever met. And she was dealing with HIV patients because it was cheaper. It's only about 50 pence to buy opium. And these people are so poor. And what I watched there is what I'm watching now, was the Chinese coming in over on the edge of northern Myanmar. They had put, ethnic cleansing is the only way I could describe it. They had put the local people out of their homes in order to build a dam. And it's sad to say they were taking over that place for the minerals. They were extracting the minerals. That's what they wanted. And for us to watch this and to see people being pushed further and further and further back, I have to say it was one of the most poor, displaced camps I'd ever seen. The ethnic groups and the women and children in particular were suffering from mines that were being planted, landmines, and they couldn't stay in their villages. And what I found incredible was the armed groups were in cahoots with the army. So you had two sections talking together about whose mines they were, so that both could benefit. But it was the people who were being put off their land. And it's similar to what I'm now seeing in Gaza, where I've been, where again, you could only describe it as people being forcibly displaced. So I did go to many places as a volunteer, but also with international organizations, with President Jimmy Carter, who had the Carter Center. He's well known as being, I write about him in my book and actually say that he was a better president maybe out of office, or more famous out of office, than he ever was in office. He was an incredible person. Everywhere I went with him in the West Bank, and the Americans couldn't go into Gaza. But I remember the time when I went down to Jerusalem and they were stopping the Palestinians from voting at the local post office. And Jimmy Carter said, "We'll see about that." And so I went along with him and he knocked on the door. And can you imagine the post office here in Hollywood, if you knock on the door and the door's opened and the postmaster says, "Who are you?" And then suddenly said, "It's the President of the United States," who's standing outside demanding that I allow the Palestinians to vote. And they did vote. It was incredible, but it was also a very sad place. And this was back in 2005. Hamas got elected at the time in Gaza. And I remember coming back and saying to the Americans, "You better start talking to them." Because they're running the health services. I asked the people outside the polling station, "Why are you voting for Hamas, particularly the women?" And they said, "Because they're putting food on our table and they're running the hospitals and they're providing the health services." It was a pretty good message to political parties everywhere. If you want to get a vote, you need to be delivering for the people on the ground. But that was the governing section. It was long before they'd started becoming militant. But I could see the militancy was going to increase as a result of Netanyahu, who I also met back then, and Arafat. David Trimble and David Irvine and myself were invited along with people from Costa Rica and El Salvador and different conflict regions to come and talk about our own resolutions. And we met both of them. But it was quite something to realize that Netanyahu back then is the Netanyahu still running Israel today. But our message was that you need to get into dialogue, because we had finally got into dialogue here. And that's the work that I am still doing. Is just back last week from Warsaw, where I was working with Ukrainians. That was through the British Foreign and Commonwealth and International Office, which rarely, Father Stephen rarely invites us, because I don't know what it is, but it's often the Irish conflict resolution in Dublin that asks and draws on the experience in Northern Ireland. But more recently, London has recognised the conflict in Northern Ireland as not just a little domestic conflict between different tribes, but as actually, in some ways, it's now allowed to be called a war. So in many ways, the resolutions and the laws, the international laws that now apply, they never did during our time of negotiations. The Geneva Protocol didn't apply to prisoners and the prisoners of the conflict, which to this day is one of the problems I'm still trying to resolve in terms of those who were released cannot get visas to the United States, to Canada or Australia. They're not entitled to mortgages. They cannot get insurance. They cannot adopt, and so on, because it's seen as having a criminal conviction as opposed to a political conviction. So those would be some of the issues that we would have to negotiate with them. It's never been lifted. The United States in particular has reinforced it after 9/11. So there are grandchildren in Northern Ireland at the minute. I think there were about 20,000 prisoners. So if you think of all of those in terms of their partners, their children and their grandchildren who are banned from visiting the United States. So it's quite a substantial number of people. So perhaps in the work that I'm doing in the coming months and in the next year, I'm hoping, because we've just appointed an international expert now to involve themselves in, as a direct person with powers of assessment, which we didn't have on the Commission. I'm a member, 4 people on the Commission, 3 others. One is an American who was George Bush's envoy to Northern Ireland. He's been appointed by the British government, Irish government, former ambassador to the United States, and a local lawyer, and myself are the 2 Northern Ireland folks. And the 4 of us for the last 10 years have been sitting on this commission. Well, first I drafted the recommendations after the 2 people were murdered in the markets, 2 men, and there was an accusation that the IRA had broken their ceasefire, and that was in 2016. And the parties got back into talks called Fresh Start. Some might have said it was False Start. And they asked us, 3 of us, Lord Alderdice, myself, and John McBurney, to draft a strategy for the disbandment of paramilitaries. The word came from them, from the parties, the word disbandment. It almost sounded like an event rather than a process. But I signed up for 6 months, and I'm there 11 years. And I'm hoping that this will be my last year. And things are beginning to move in Northern Ireland now. 26 years after we signed the agreement, you might well ask, how is it that on both sides you can still be talking about armed groups and paramilitaries? Some will give you a rationale that they're still around because of the ideological cause of the Troubles. One side, orange on green. But that rationale no longer exists. Of course, Brexit made a huge difference. Every time we felt we were moving forward, stage left, circumstances came in, and we were moving backwards. And of course, the Assembly collapsed. But we did draw up that strategy, 40 recommendations. The government set up the treaties, the British and Irish government, and then appointed 2 new people. The British representative, as I said, has been a good third eye. It's always good to have an international person looking down from the balcony. And the Irish representative and us, myself and John. And we have just this past week recommended, and the governments have accepted it, that we bring back an international person to engage directly with the groups who tell us that they want to move away. We're talking here the new IRA and other Republican groups not in ceasefire. And I have gone in and out of the prisons, and I've been around because we did have the powers to engage face-to-face and directly. Now, some people might well say, how could you be talking to people like that in this day and age in Northern Ireland? But that's what we were set up to do. And on the other side, we are engaged with the Loyalist Community Council, we're engaged with the UVF, the Red Hand Commando, the UDA, the alphabet soup, as I call it, of lots of different groups, and they are on ceasefire. But it's also now aware that there are other groups who are springing up as a kind of continuity loyalist group. The issue, as you might have heard from the Assembly debate on Monday, about this very motion of appointing an independent international expert was they're all gangsters and criminals. and they had the opportunity to leave when I negotiated the agreement along with the other parties, and they should have left the scene. And all they're doing now is torturing people, extorting money, money laundering. And I know about that, and I know exactly who the police should be going after. But the police tell us that they can't arrest their way out of this problem. And on the other hand, there isn't enough prisons or prison places, as you and I would well know. So something else had to come in, and that was our recommendation to appoint an international person. Alongside that, we have always said there should be a criminal justice response. And we established an organisation called the Paramilitary Crime Task Force. We gave them extra powers to go in and take, as we would say it, the unexplained wealth of individuals who can't explain how they're living in houses and driving SUVs and have what some of them call, and it is all men, men's sheds in their back gardens, full of very interesting bits and pieces of quite wealthy paintings and various things and computers. So they should be going and doing that job, and they have, and they've, the latest figures say that they have taken back 5 million. We don't see as much as what happened in Dublin, which I wish we would see a lot more of, which is the assets taken off them. And then the community can see this work being done, and they will then feel less fear of coming forward and giving evidence. So we say the criminal justice response. Our courts are probably quite broken in terms of the delay, in terms of remand. You'd be surprised, well, you will know, Father Stephen, the numbers who have been released from prison, who are on very serious offences, who have been released because it's against the European Convention on Human Rights, after 2 or 3 or 4 years, that they're still not, their cases haven't come to trial. We need to fix that. We've also asked for legislation to be introduced on organised crime groups, which some of these are, because it's very hard to get them for membership of prescribed organisations. And so in Scotland and England, they have legislation where there are 5 or more belonging to a group who are in an organised crime group, that they can then be treated as criminals and taken to court much quicker than our current process. That legislation will shortly go through the Assembly. It has been successful both in England and Scotland. So why did Northern Ireland fall so far behind, is the question. And why did it take our commission to keep pushing that? So that's the criminal side of the house. The other side of the house was the rich pickings. What happens that these kids in these areas are getting picked up by paramilitaries? Why do they see that as an aspiration? We fall back on the issue of education and the systemic issues. Did the peace agreements lift everyone? And did everyone do well out of the dividend of the peace process? No, they didn't. And perhaps if I had to go back to the table, I would have looked at that more seriously in terms of the social and economic disadvantages. If you ask me, I would probably say the people who have done pretty well out of it, and if they were here, you can challenge me, have been the lawyers. I remember on this day, this week, going to the White House many years ago. I was actually in the taxi in the cab, as they say in America, with David Irvine, and we were asking him to bring us to the White House, and he said, "Where are you guys from?" And we said, "We're from Ireland." Credit to David, he also said Ireland because it was St. Patrick's Day. And he said, "Oh, is that where St. Patrick put all the snakes out of Ireland?" Quick as a flash, David Irvine said, "No, he left a lot of two-legged ones behind, and they're mostly lawyers, and the others are politicians." Quick as a flash. And I thought, well, that's quite an interesting way to put that on St. Patrick's Day. But in any case, that's the issue that perhaps we didn't pay enough attention to. When I got up from the table on Good Friday, April 10th, 1998, what did we not pay, or what could we have done more? There is a section in the agreement which the Women's Coalition, and it's well known now, advocated for, which is the section entitled Reconciliation and the Needs of Victims. Had we not been at the table, that chapter of the agreement would not have been in the agreement. Remember who gets to negotiations. And this will be the same in Ukraine, where we've just come from, and in the Middle East, where I'm about to go. in the beginning of May. It's generally armed groups who are asked to make the ceasefires, and it's the constitutional parties. Very rarely is it civic society leaders, the business people, the trade unions, the church leaders, who have something to say about what creates peace, makes peace, sustains peace. That's what our role was in the Women's Coalition, was to bring that message via those leaders in all of those walks of life to the table. And so we did a lot of work in the 2 years during the negotiations, and indeed in the years previous. I mean, the other party said, where'd these women come from, as if we'd fallen out of the sky. But the women had been working at the interface across the peace lines, as they do everywhere, on the front lines, keeping the peace and trying to keep their children alive and putting food on the table and speaking to people that no one else would talk to. Maybe it was safer for them. And so when we negotiated the agreement, it was a difficult thing because you were talking about prisoner releases, disarmament, demobilisation and the reintegration of prisoners. Disarmament meaning decommissioning of weapons, which tortured us for the following 10 years. Demobilisation, the army returned to barracks, and the armed groups agreeing to stand down. Worked our way through that process. Reform of policing, which was difficult. Again, international independent body of people called the Patton Commission wrote the report, presented it, and it's now known as a model in terms of advancing community policing, talking about the systemic issues, talking about recruiting. The issue of Catholics and having a quota for Catholics was huge. But again, as Human Rights Commissioner, I had to oversee the compliance and say that is an international norm. Where there's an underrepresentation, you are allowed to introduce affirmative action for an ethnic group or an underrepresented minority. And so it did, and it happened, but it was only for 10 years or until the police reached the quota of 30%. It's no longer there. Father Stephen, you may know that I tried to negotiate with the prison service for a similar quota, which has a similar problem, but it never happened because by that stage the political parties were in the assembly. I stood in that first assembly, and Patton would never have got passed in that first assembly if they had demanded a consensus, a cross-community consensus, because one side of the assembly was saying, we're for the Patton reforms, and the other side said, definitely not. This is the worst thing that could ever happen to policing. But it fell to Westminster to introduce those changes. And as I watch Peter Mandelson now, who's the British ambassador to the United States, he was the one who led the debate, and I'd have to say he almost destroyed the whole legislation as it went through, except for political leaders from Northern Ireland who stood up to the process and saw what was recommended in Patton got itself into legislation, and it did. And so the agreement became the Northern Ireland Act, and the Patton legislation became the Policing Act. And those are good examples of what we take to other countries that are coming out of conflict. They are models of how sequencing happens, how you slowly but surely put in each piece. My biggest regret, as I know from my work in Colombia, is that we did not have a validation committee, an implementation committee. We got up on Good Friday and everybody said goodbye. I met one of the guys at the Four Corners Festival last week for the first time in 26 years. He had been at the table. He was a negotiator. He was representing the UDP. You might have read some of his pieces recently about his regrets of having joined the UDA and having been in the UDP. Davy Adams is his name. I hadn't seen him since the day we'd signed the agreement. You might well ask, how did that happen? We actually, in the Women's Coalition, advocated for all of the parties that had been to the agreement to stay together and that they use the same election system that brought us in to the peace talks. It was an unusual election system. It had a list system and a constituency-based system. And we, the two of us, Pearl Sager and I, were elected off the list. You had to reach a threshold of 10,000. It was incredible after 6 weeks that the Women's Coalition managed to get 8,000 votes, enough to get us over the line as the 9th party. But I knew that it was going to be very difficult for that small UDP party, who did play a good role, kept their prisoners moving, kept them all saying, this is it, it's over. We agree with this peace agreement. And I stood and watched them during that referendum after the agreement, when they took on the likes of the Reverend Ian Paisley and those who said no. And this was loyalist on loyalist. And I watched them on the streets and the villages and the towns, because we had taken a bus, because we all had children at the time, who are now adults, an open deck bus, and we went around every village and town with loudspeakers asking and begging people to say yes. And we were up against it in terms of those. Saying no is one word. Explaining the peace agreement took a long time at a door. And people said to me, this is a terrorist charter, you're letting prisoners out of jail with a go-free card. And we said, no, it's not an amnesty. There is a condition attached, and there will be a commission overseeing. If any of them reoffend, they go straight back in again and serve out their sentences. But people didn't understand that. They thought it was just... by that stage, there were only 700 left, and they were going to get out at some stage. But it was hard on victims, and I work with WAVE. I'm a patron of WAVE, which is the largest kind of trauma regional counselling centre for victims. And there are more people crossing WAVE's door today than ever, either because of the OMA inquiry or because there's a release coming now, because the legacy is coming up. And they're now coming and talking and telling their stories in a way that never happened before. I was there on International Women's Day to spend all of Saturday with them. The families of the disappeared, who I've worked with down through the years until we've recovered all but 5 bodies. But that was not an easy process either. And that process had to engage between the commission that we established for the location of the return of victims' remains. Very long title, very sad title. Many of those families didn't even have a death certificate. They couldn't even get their inheritance and their sales of the property sorted if you don't have a death certificate. So we had to do that. I did that at the Assembly, but the Commission went and started digging for the bodies. And slowly but surely we got better at it and got forensics in from the States. That's an interesting story. Mitchell Rees, who was on the Commission with me, said, I have been lobbied by Irish people in America who had been digging the railroad. And when they died, their bodies were just dumped in massive graves. That's how cheap the labour was. And now their families want their bodies back. That was 100 years prior to the families of the next generation saying we want to give them a Christian burial. And they found this forensic team from Virginia, the old colonial Virginia, who had been digging up the archaeological kind of remains of when England had taken over Virginia. And he said, I know exactly the team that you should get. And the team came, and they trained up forensic people here, and very quickly the bodies started to be found. We were digging, I went with WAVE too. Well, I didn't do the digging, but I stood in many a site with them in lonely, lonely places out in the middle of bogland to see if that's where the bodies were. But they were found, but very, very slowly. And 40 years going to funerals, Father Stephen, where the parish priest would bring the body in and the families would say, this is the happiest day of my life. I thought I would never live to see the return of my father's body. You can imagine how poignant that is. But that came as a result of the IRA deciding on a system by which they would give information without recrimination to the Commission. And the Commission would act on that information and then start. And of course the memories were bad and bog fit. Anybody like me who grew up in the countryside and went out to turf bogs will know that the turf shifts. And so it's not always easy to find. But many of them were found. We have many, many less of the disappeared. When I go to Kosovo, they tell me there are 40,000 still outstanding in Kosovo, disappeared. And they're still negotiating with the Serbs to try and find out where the massive graves are. And of course, that's going to be the case in many other conflicts where they just have to bury them immediately and come back someday to see where those loved ones were. As we know now in Bosnia, in terms of the bones, that it's only through the bones that they're able to find the DNA of oftentimes a father and 3 sons. So that's the reality. War has the face of a woman, but it also has the face of grieving people who have still memories of the bereaved and the injured. Only recently have we managed to get pensions for the injured. The people here were badly injured. 40,000 were seriously injured. And only physical injury has been compensated, not psychological injury. And I have often said, what about the moral injury? And we've only now beginning to have a discussion about that. So those are some of the things I've been working in terms of bringing the local to the global and bringing the lessons from the global back. And from Colombia, the lesson was, after they had negotiated for 5 years in Havana, in Cuba, with the oversight of the Norwegian government, and they brought many from here often to Colombia to discuss what was happening, including those who had been active here but had now stood down and were now politically active. And FARC were very interested in that story. FARC had been at war with the government for 50 years in Colombia and reached an agreement, and I was there on the day that they signed it in Cartagena, but I was worried that they mightn't get the referendum through. And they lifted a pen, President Santos and Timochenko, who I'd met, who was the head of FARC, and they said, I hope I get this right. It was made out of a bullet, and it said, this bullet wrote our past, this pen will write our future. It was a very important moment. I also remember 3 jets coming flying above, and they hadn't announced that these were peaceful jets, and everybody dived for cover because they thought they were going to be suddenly bombed from the air. But the first time the Colombian agreement went through, it failed. And it failed because of myths and rumours. They had to go back again. But the second time they did it through the Congress, and it did pass. And slowly it's working. And I'll be shortly looking in Notre Dame, the university in the United States. I can never say it the way an American say it. Notre Dame, in South Bend, Indiana. They have been given by the United Nations the monitoring mechanism to oversee each piece of that agreement. I wish we had someone who had overseen our pieces of the agreement. There are still pieces that are outstanding, like the Bill of Rights that I drafted, that's still sitting gathering dust in Westminster. But perhaps Brexit has a silver lining. The difficulty when I drafted it was that there was a political party diversity of opinions. Unionists thought that it was a reflection of the lack of rights that civil rights had raised and didn't see a need for a Bill of Rights. And since Britain didn't have a Bill of Rights, why should Northern Ireland? But it was in the peace agreement, and it fell to Westminster. And I've said to Westminster, it's not to the Assembly, which they kept insisting that I get consensus at the Assembly. And I kept saying, I can't do that, no more than Patton could get consensus on policing. It's your job to legislate. But they didn't want to. By now it was then 2010. And they said, no, let the Assembly decide. It's never happened. But the reverse happened in 2016 when we had Brexit. And since then, people have said, what about if we come out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which was introduced as a result of the peace agreement, and it's now justiciable in the courts? What happens if all of those rights disappear? And now with the potential for a referendum, I meet many unionists who say, what about that Bill of Rights? And a Charter of Rights, which is also was in the agreement for the island of Ireland. So it didn't matter what part of the island that you lived on, you were entitled to the following, the equivalency. And actually, one of the outstanding issues for me is that we have a really good inquest system here in Northern Ireland. And inquests are really important because you get to the truth of what happened, either, massive killings or one death, a non-natural death. And we have judges sitting in those courts. I've been involved in one in the south of Ireland, in Letterkenny, for 25 years. It's been, 20 years now, it's been going up and down. It's the case of Dennis Donaldson. And it's a general practitioner. It's a local doctor who runs the inquests. So I have been saying to the Taoiseach and to others, actually, we're much better here in terms of what has changed in our judicial system and the provisions that we're making for people than you are in the south. So that's why I talk about cross-jurisdictional equivalency. And the two human rights commissions, I passed it today, we were in Dublin, walking up Jervis Street. I had to go down there every 3 months. All of the commissioners were mandated to meet with the South Commission, which was good. And as a result of Brexit, those two commissions have produced reports on what will happen to people on both sides, one part of the island now in Europe and the other part not. So I still wonder if we had had an implementation committee, a validation committee like the Colombians did, would we actually have had a body saying that piece of the agreement is still outstanding? And there are other issues, integrated education. There are issues of shared housing, and the Housing Executive creating estates where people live together alongside each other. There was a provision for a civic forum, which was a consultative body on social and economic and cultural issues. It's often our cultural issues that divides us, bonfires and flags, and many of those issues. And that forum was meant to sit and advise the Assembly, because some of these are too hot to handle, and advise them on what should happen. It was a proposal by the Women's Coalition, it's in the agreement, and it has never, ever, it sat for about 6 weeks. And then when the parties came together, they said, we probably don't need that, and stood it down. We did need it, especially at times when the Assembly was down. And probably now we will certainly need it again, because it's a place where people can openly talk. Business leaders who are accustomed to making deals, trade unions, disability sector, the children and youth sector, women's sector, the faith community, all of those would be represented on that civic forum. We had devised a process by which representatives from each of those could come together and deliberate. And if ever there was a time when we should be in dialogue and deliberating on what's going to happen in the next 10 years, that's now. So they're struggling a little bit to see what forum could be accepted in order to have those discussions. Maybe I should stop there. I think if you want to ask me questions about my work on the paramilitaries, about the work on the international work, on the peace agreement, or what's happening currently in Ukraine, or Gaza, or the Middle East, or South Sudan. Let's not forget the war in Sudan. When I was there, there were 100,000 people in the tents, and it was 45 degrees. Luckily, the container that I was in, a tin container, but it works, those containers, you can put them in very quickly. It actually had air conditioning, so I can't complain. But it was energy bars that we were eating because there was so little food. And we had a chicken one night that we found on the road that a young fella was selling. I was just hoping that it didn't eat anything that wasn't too good for me. But we survived. I was there for 10 days 2 years ago. 100,000 were in the tents. I did a function for Concern last week in Dublin, and Dominic McSorley, who's from Belfast, who was the director for 40 years, an inspirational leader, if ever there was one, after retirement went back to Sudan and spent the last 2 years there in the middle of that war, making sure people had nutrition and food and water. A very, very dangerous place. He told me there were 100,000 when I visited 2 years ago. He said there are now 137,000. And that's climate change, because they're there because of the floods. They're on higher land, but they're in the worst conditions you can imagine. Bamboo huts and shacks. But how do you feed 137,000? And I watched women giving birth in the most primitive of conditions, where there was just a wooden pole. That was their maternity hospital, with a corrugated zinc roof. But it was quite incredible also, the passion and the commitment that the humanitarian workers had. Because I asked them, what's that little box there? It was in the local language. Oh, they said, that's the complaint box for any of the mothers who didn't think we did a good enough job. So I'll finish there. So I finish with that, saying you bring more back from what you see and learn than what you bring. And often coming back here in the work that I'm doing back here, it's those lessons of putting food on the table, keeping people safe, and hoping that you can create human security without billions and billions being spent on weapons. which is what we're currently watching. Thank you for listening.
We'll have a few questions if you're happy enough with that. Like some water, we even can supply water for you.
Oh, you've a glass.
That glass.
Well done.
It's my glass. Don't be taking it with you. One of the great things in the book that I loved reading was the whole dynamic of the Women's Coalition, first of all, coming together because that had never happened before as a women's party, and then the fact that you got elected into what was going to be a decision-making setup. Were you very welcomed? Leave that with you.
Well, what I just did today, because I had to give a talk last night in Dublin, was that a lot of the folk down there don't realise how tough it was up here. And so there's a film that's been made called Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs, which a local film company had made. And the good news is that the book and that film is now going into a BBC series. And it'll be 1 hour for 6 sessions. It's a film company that are going to make it. And I'm glad, because I think the next generation forget. And I don't want them to have just only those memories, but also what worked. And it is the story. Now, your question to me, it's the story of the women coming together. And when the Downing Street Declaration was declared by John Major and Albert Reynolds, it was actually Sir Patrick Mayhew's wife, Lady Jane Mayhew, who invited me and a number of other women to Hillsborough Castle. And she said, look, this is going to be a serious problem. There are no female MPs, female MEPs. Northern Ireland had a dearth at that stage of early 90s of women in decision making. But she knew there had been a lot of work in the communities. May Blood was one of the leaders at that stage, well known, now deceased, in the Protestant community from the Shankill Road, and great voice of leadership. And her and I, and a number of us, then decided, as a result of Lady Jane Mayhew saying there will be no responses from the women who are so active on the ground and can feed into this whole process of consultation on the Downing Street Declaration. And so we ran a conference, and we did it in the rural area, because everything often is in Belfast. And we provided buses and childcare and food, and the women came in their thousands. So much so that I had to ask the university to provide separate rooms with videos so that the proceedings and any decisions could be in all the rooms that people couldn't fit into this big plenary session. And I knew then there was an appetite. And so when the peace talks were declared, this was post-ceasefire, of which we noted the 30th anniversary last year. And we decided we would call public meetings across the country, placed advertisements in the newspapers. And I remember this meeting where people said, don't get involved in politics. It's great the work that women are doing, and we're much more effective in the work we're doing. If you get in politics, you'll have blood on your hands. And that was quite something. And then this little voice at the back said, it's time to wave goodbye to dinosaurs. And I said, that's probably what we will probably need to do. People who are refusing to go into peace talks after 30 years, after 30 long years, and saying, some of what I'm hearing in Ukraine, no, we'll be victorious. We will beat the other side. And that was the discussion we had. And we had 6 weeks. And we asked the government to open up the electoral process. They were only going to allow the parties that currently existed. They opened it up because they wanted the 2 armed groups on the loyalist side to be at the table. Sinn Féin were going to be there anyway. But they also needed the loyalists parties to be there, alongside the DUP and Ulster Unionists and Bob McCartney's party, the name of whom I forget now. I think it was the United Unionist Party. It's now dissolved. He's local resident, I understand. Yeah, I do know that because some woman in Hollywood hit him with her handbag, and it made the television because of what he had said to her whenever she met him on the street. That kind of was quite something. I didn't ever get hit by a handbag, but I got hit by a whole lot worse. When we went out on the referendum, someone reminded me of this the other day, because you forget it. that, we got hit with sticks, we got spat at, we got kicked, because you're talking to very angry people who really don't want to hear your message.
Did they want women?
They told us that the only women that should be at the table are the ones who should be polishing it. Publicly saying this. It's in the film Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs that I'll send you the link and you can send it out to whoever wants it. And it was repeated last night by the journalist who made for RTE. I'd forgotten that she'd interviewed me, but she also interviewed Peter Robinson, who I'm now working with very closely, and Seamus Mallon, who wouldn't say it now, but they said it then. Peter Robinson said, "Who are these women? They don't represent the good housewives of Ulster that I know, who know their real job." And Seamus, unfortunately, is on record in that film saying, I don't understand why these women are coming together to do what they do. I believe in merit, and I can't understand. We have women, and all the parties have women. I think they're a cult, and they'll probably grow in on each other and disappear. That was then. This is now. They changed their views over the years. We've now 36% of women in the local assembly, and 3 party leaders are women. But there were none when we were doing this. But Father Stephen, I don't want to repeat the insults, because some of them are pretty bad. But what keeps you real is your kids, your children. I had 2 sons, and I came home, and I was told in the Forum for Dialogue and Understanding, which I renamed the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding after the first day, I was told to shut up and sit down, you silly woman. So I came home that night trying to put my younger son Rowan to bed, who was about 6 or 7. And he looked out, and it was a beautiful sunny night. And he said, "That's terrible what they're saying, but you are a bit silly putting me to bed at this time."
It's going to get the mic too.
Mo. I heard it. You want to ask me about Mo? She was a breath of fresh air. Now remember, in that the last week of Easter week, she, unknown to many, had a brain tumour. She was being treated for chemotherapy, I think, but also she had an intravenous drip in her arm. She was on her bare feet, and she wasn't wearing her wig. And she was working herself into the ground in Castle buildings, running up and down the corridors between the parties. It was quite amazing to watch. At the same time, some of the men in the other parties were coming to me and saying, "Could you ever tell Mo to put that wig on? Because we can't be negotiating with a bald-headed woman." So, those are some of the memories. But she was incredible. Very inclusive, because we were small parties. There were 4 small parties, the Northern Ireland Labour Party, Women's Coalition, and the 2 Loyalist parties. And we formed ourselves into a group of 4 so that the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach didn't have to keep repeating meetings amongst all 4 of us. And all the way through, she included us and felt that the message that we had to say at the table, as did Senator Mitchell, was important. And after the agreement was over, when the current British ambassador to the United States would say, "I haven't time to be meeting all these folks," Mo would say, "That's a mistake, and you'll pay the price." And as David Irvine would have said, "He doesn't have time to meet me? Well, good luck to you." Yeah. So.
Hello, Monica.
How you doing?
I was at an event for International Women's Day there a few days ago, and at the event there were pictures of women who had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And when I was walking and looking at the pictures, 2 of the people you will recall maybe from 1976 was Mairead Corrigan and Betty Williams. But I couldn't help thinking, but maybe it's just me, if you said to people today, who were Betty Williams and Mairead Corrigan, people would say, who? And the question I would like to ask is what your memories are of that, but what contribution or how important was their contribution to where we are today?
It was incredibly important. And I was, in the film you will see the massive numbers of those women marching down. First they marched down the Shankill Road, and then they marched down the Falls Road. I was in America at the time. A very good friend of mine, a student, had been murdered at Queen's in 1974, and I decided it was time for me to get out, and I won a scholarship. I got a scholarship to Michigan, and I was sitting watching from a distance. And actually, it was one of the reasons why, apart from also being so far away and watching bombs going off, that I decided after I got my postgrad that I would come home. But watching them, and here's the sadness of it, because the women, some of the women that were in it joined us, and Anne McCann, Peace Women became the Peace People. Was that the right thing? People said to me after the Women's Coalition, why don't you become the People's Coalition? You'll get more people being supportive. I thought when they were the women, they got the right message, but they had stones fired at them. Walking down the Falls Road, they had to put up their umbrellas in order to shield themselves from, as I remember, later when it happened to me, from shielding, getting their skull cracked open when we went to Harryville Church to support the parishioners trying to get on International Women's Day into the church. The protesters threw these bricks, so it's not a pleasant thing, and they landed on us. And my memory was exactly like that. I wish we'd brought umbrellas. They had the smarties to do that because they knew, they predicted. And it was Republicans on the Falls Road who didn't like their message and said, you are just housewives for peace, any old peace. And where's the justice part of your message? It's a bit like what I'm hearing in Ukraine. But they stood their test, and the funny part of that is that people think I am Betty Williams because of my second name. And I have to say, no, she was 30 years older than me.
Good evening, Monica. I was just one thing that struck me as you were talking there is the kind of constant theme around justice and injustice. And I was just wondering where that sense, I suppose, of injustice came from, but also what has kind of given you the hunger to do something about it? Why does that manifest itself in a lifetime of activism and work?
It's a very important question, because last night in Dublin, when I was talking to a large group of lawyers who are involved in mediation, which I think is great rather than going into courts all the time, to mediate disputes. And some of them are not just family disputes, they're very serious issues and conflict in every walk of life. And what I often found here was that mediators, they say, were wanting both parties to just get into a dialogue. And the human rights folks would come along and say, but you're looking for peace at any price, and you'll settle without justice. And they would turn to the human rights experts and say, but you're looking for the perfect peace, because you're looking for all these rights to be introduced. And there would be a lot of clashes. And I was in those rooms when the conflict resolution folk on one side, using mediation skills, would say, well, we'll get justice. And yes, we believe in justice and mercy and compassion. And the other would say, well, we actually just don't hope for justice. We need justice to be on the table. So I'm a great believer in accountability. As the Human Rights Commissioner, obviously, I would say that. But justice has to mean more than just going to the courts. It also has to be about, as we now see, the right to have water, as I see in Gaza, where they suddenly put concrete down the wells to stop the Palestinians from drinking. That's justice. And that's an economic right. Because here we always talked about civil rights and political rights, but rarely did we ever talk about social and economic rights. And when I visit Africa, the Africans understand that as being justice, those rights. And I think it was probably COVID that brought that. I had a battle in the Bill of Rights when I put some rights in around those issues. There is a right to education, but when I put the right to dignified life with healthcare, people said, well, what had that to do with the conflict? And I said, well, you know, it doesn't matter if you're wealthy or not. You have a right, and I tested it actually once in the courts when we didn't have the drug tamoxifen and everywhere else had it. and it was a postal code. And it was Michael McWilliams who was the Minister for Health, and I said, you know, this is against Article 2, the right to life, because people could die if they don't get this remission drug. And at the door of the court, he settled it. Now, the danger for that was my own oncologist, when I got cancer, said, well, that was good that you got that, because you're going to be on it too. I would not have known that. But he said, you know what happened? He said, they took the money for that drug off other drugs that other people should have. Now, that's also an infringement, and that's often the battle between rights, entitlements. But you're absolutely right. What does justice mean? Here, one person's justice was another person's grievance. And clearly, when last night I unveiled the Bill of Rights that Sheila Murnahan from Oma, Geraldine, good Oma woman, had stood over in the Assembly in 1965 and brought forward a Bill of Rights. She was the elected MP for Queen's University to the Senate. The old Parliament in Stormont had a Senate and a House of Commons and a kind of funny system of electing senators, but she was one. And she introduced the Bill of Rights 4 times, and it failed 4 times. Now, had that been introduced in 1965, would we have had the problems that we ended up in 1969? And in my book, by the time fair employment came in and the equal franchise came in terms of doing away with gerrymandering, and the right to housing based on need came in, one side said too little, too late, and the other side said not an inch and no further. And that was the battle that then took place. So it was a long struggle, because people then went down the militant road. One side saw it as a criminal wave, and the other side saw it as an ideological wave in terms of looking at the causes. And to this day, in terms of the legacy of the Troubles, I still think that exists in terms of how do we look at the past, what kind of narrative will we tell? And we, as Mandela said to us in South Africa, if you don't know the cause of your problem, I don't know how you're going to solve it. It's pretty good. Yeah. I think we know each other, yeah.
Especially as a woman, I just want to preface what I'm about to say by saying there couldn't be anybody in this room that wouldn't be humbled by hearing the life you have led and what you have done and what you have achieved for all of us. But as a lawyer, I also have to, I feel I have to perhaps correct some things that maybe aren't just strictly correct. I don't think lawyers have been the people who have done so well from the peace process. I would have to say that criminal lawyers did much better before the ceasefire, during the Diplock trials. And over the last 30 years, the criminal legal aid fees have not increased. And in fact, there are many young barristers, criminal barristers and solicitors who were in receipt of tax credits and universal credit. Such was the level of their pay, and many of them have been on strike. Also, in the last 30 years, women like me and many men like me got out of their beds at 2 in the morning and went to Musgrave Police Station for £25.60. And that rate has increased very marginally. I don't even think you would get a plumber to come out to look at your tap for under £100. So I don't think it is strictly correct to say that lawyers have been the people who have benefited from the peace process.
I agree with you entirely. I'm saying this is what's being said in terms of the inquiries. I totally supported the Bloody Sunday inquiry. But people said, well, who did well out of that? It's the folks that live in Contrail. That's what you're up against in terms of trying to get justice and accountability. And people saying too much money was put into that instead of into the hospitals. I agree. I mean, I myself had to take on the law, the Chief Commissioner of Human Rights, totally supportive of lawyers and going to court. What would we do without it? And at the minute, that is a serious issue in terms of the barrister strike. Because again, it's creating huge delays. But I'm totally in favour of legal aid, and I actually went to the Minister of Justice and said, it is a right to this, because people who don't have it will not have a fair trial, equal before the law. And particularly, I work with domestic violence victims all this 40 years, and we did manage to hold it for victims of domestic violence, but we almost lost it. So those were the kind of things that were being said as a result of the commission that Declan Morgan is currently chairing, that it's costing millions, or will. I'm on Canova, which has investigated the Informer, steak knife, many, many murders, and we're about to publish the response to the Glenanne gang, which is so important because these were hidden. Dublin Monaghan bombs, all of the issues of what happened in County Down, County Armagh. It's cost 40 million, and it is all lawyers and investigators.
Yeah, but the little cogs at the bottom, people like us who are going out at night and going every Saturday to McGilligan and to the prisons.
We've been there.
And yes, I've seen Father there as well.
Yeah, totally.
Just one final question for you. In terms of one of your observations were about getting the business people should be up there talking and being part of the process for peace, and their voice should be heard along with the politicians and the paramilitaries or whatever. Do you still hold that view, given the big businessman that we have at the top table nowadays and the peace that he seems to be rolling out in Trump?
Well, you know what my answer to that would be? He's more of a clown than a businessman. I'm just really frightened about what's happening in those decisions. And they're not good business deals. You don't play games. It's very, very frightening. But I think during Brexit, and I was watching the business people, the hoteliers and the people who were in the tourist trade and the marketeers, the farmers, the agricultural sector, they were coming forward in ways that I had not seen before, speaking up for what needed to be resolved. And it was good to see them putting their heads up. But when we do capacity building, and we use some examples for how business does it. And there's one called the orange peel, which my sister's better at than I am. And one side needs the juice of the orange and the other side needs the peel. But they argue and argue and argue because they don't realise, they all think we need the whole orange. And it's really about how to train people in making a deal, and that both sides then benefit when they get into that nitty-gritty. So I do think it's important to have business people, as we saw in Ukraine, in Warsaw last week, the week before, I came home Saturday, I was astounded at the number that were in the room who were business leaders, running the energy sector. There was a woman who was running the entire agricultural sector, because Ukraine is a food basket for the global south. Negotiated the deal with the Russians to let the ships get through across the Black Sea and onwards from Turkey. They've already negotiated that. The women running the coal mines, women are down the coal mines as we speak because the men are at the front line. It's all women business leaders that are running the country. And they were at the table. And I have to say, I did say to the politicians, they are much more pragmatic at the minute in understanding that a ceasefire is coming and negotiations are coming. Because what the politicians were saying is, we need more weapons and we just need Europe to step up and give us more. And we need to have victory. And we need to be victorious. And politicians tend to come from that background of, because I was there with many, that our certainty has to be on the table and be reinforced. And then you have business people coming in saying, well, I'm telling you, the country's going to be in trouble if we keep this war going much longer. And we now know that they are. So I do think there's an element of pragmatism. I don't come from that background. I actually come from the legal background. I come from that side of the house, but I've watched the business people, and you learn what we're really saying to each other here is every profession has something to offer the other. And likewise, the grassroots working people and the communities have something to offer at high-level decision-making, because they've been keeping the country running too.
Anyone else?
Just two questions. Just two, if that's okay. One is a trivial question, just to lighten the mood, because it's all very serious.
Has it been that heavy?
When you were burning chairs for
The what?
Biafra, when you were burning chairs
Oh, yeah,
for
yeah.
Biafra, were there no pallets available?
Do you know we lost money that night because we had to pay back for those chairs?
Right. The serious question. It's quite clear from your history, and you have a long history with this whole area. It's quite clear that you need to have all of the, to use common parlance, stakeholders involved. As you say, the politicians can get involved, but they don't really have a good vision of the future. Having the business people involved, because they know the value of a buck, they need to be involved as well too.
I'm going to come a little bit closer because I'm having difficulty hearing it. Having business people involved does what?
Sorry, it must have been all the explosions that you've heard.
Have you put the microphone up?
Right, yeah.
People will be able to hear you.
Okay, I'm not used to this kind of stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of the background that you have, where do you think this wee part of the world is in terms of approaching what might be called a Shangri-La of maybe a state of equanimity? How far along in terms of a timeline do you think the wee north is? And how far does it have to go?
Did everybody hear that? It's like, how close are we to Shangri-La? Yeah. I mean, often in our commission, we're discussing these things in terms of a racing track. And there are some folk on the 8th round of it. My sister and I used to run the 100. You wouldn't know that now, but we used to be 100 and 200 metre sprinters. So you would actually look to see how far in the track and what was the best lap to be in. So what I'm really saying to you is that some folk are on the 8th lap, and some are still stuck in the blocks and aren't getting out of them. And if you're asking me about the discussion that's coming, I think it is starting now. People are opening up to having a discussion about the future in a way that they didn't. And it certainly shouldn't be imposed because it won't work. And the agreement allowed for a referendum, if that's what you're looking at in terms of shared island, reunification, all these new words that are being applied to it. First, I have always said, and I say it in the final chapter of my book, let's find a shared place. And this is one of the biggest issues here. Have we managed to get on top of sectarianism and racism, which I still see in terms of the work that I'm doing? No. Is it as bad as it once was? It's not as bad, but it shouldn't be happening. And I mean, there are outstanding issues that are still around, as you know here, of flags flying in places. Did the leprechauns put them up? Why is there still a permission for this to be in people's faces outside churches or in certain communities? And Father Stephen, as you know, in your last parish, you've never been able to open the front door of the church. And when that church was first built, it was a cousin or a relative of ours who had to be protected. And 3 men were killed building the church that Father Stephen came here from. And that church door, front church door, has never been opened. And that's currently still the case. So that's the reality of where we're still living in terms of, are people still totally free from fear? Many are. I'm very proud of the fact that there are children alive today that may not have been had we not reached that agreement. Maybe that's how I'll end it. But it's an unfinished business. And I'm probably working as hard now, 26 years later, than the day I left that table. When George Mitchell said to us, the hard work starts now, I thought, yeah, it probably does. Had I any idea that it would take 3 decades? I'll be pushing up the daisies. I don't know, Father Stephen, if you'll be there. I hope you are. But our work never stops. The work in the prisons never stops. The work that we're still doing with these groups, that probably will, I hope, stop. But will sectarianism and racism and the attitudes, that's the hardest of all. And sometimes I have to add to that, the attitudes towards women, because that is really quite shocking at the minute in terms of these young politicians, these women, and artificial intelligence and pornographic pictures that are put up that would stop any woman from going into public life. It was hard in my day. It's much harder now.
Can we just one last question here?
Good evening, Monica. Patricia Diamond here.
Oh, yes, Patricia.
Monica, you mentioned in your lovely discussion about how far women have come from when you were a wee girl. We now have a first and deputy first. Just your reflections, not a political. You've talked a lot, and I wouldn't want to hurt your voice. But what are your reflections on what 2 women at the top can do?
Thank you for that. I think we put a lot of expectations on women when they go into those roles. And I would not have been in favour of what I saw in Margaret Thatcher at times. At times, we used to say Thatcher the milk snatcher. She was the one who took the school milk away from the children. So the question I'm saying back to you is, how good an advocate are they for good progressive change and for working together? To me, as I saw at the table, and I'm now involved with one person from each party, we meet every 3 months, who were former leaders of all those parties. And the chemistry between us is so unlike what it was 26 years ago. And we sit down and discuss every 3 months at night what we each need to do to get it on to the next stage. It is about relationships. And you only get to that when you sit down and talk to somebody. And often it's, as we were taught as children, to find the values of the other person, the values you can work with, and most importantly, the humanity in the other person, but also the legitimacy of the other person. So the First and Deputy First Minister have to see the legitimacy of each other in responsibility taking. And in Northern Ireland, that's still a big issue. I'm still going into communities where people said, I never voted for Sinn Féin to be First Minister. I'm sorry. I think we live in a democracy. We do have elections, and you will have to live with that decision. So people didn't predict that that would happen, Patricia. And so it's up to them to show the leadership that it has happened. And I do think Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness sat down, and I know they did because they've said it to me, that they wished they had talked to each other many years before, not by proxy, through the British and Irish governments. It's only when you're engaged in a relationship, as you know, with your sisters and brothers and partners and family members, that you really can get to the truth of what is going on. So yes, I wish them well. And there are blips. And I think commemorations and memorials in Northern Ireland will always be an issue. But they have stood together and they've delivered on the programme for government. And we'll judge now by what you promised you must deliver.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
It's good for women, Patricia, to see 2 women. When I was in that role, I was really burned out by journalists asking me to come on the television because they had no women. Now they have a surplus, which is great. And so I said, to them now when I see only men being asked, and often journalists are, I'm not just saying this about lawyers, I'm also saying it about journalists. Every profession needs to look at ourselves. And so when journalists say, Monica, we need you to come on now, we've only got men here, that's the only reason you want? Oh, right, well then just bring a photograph or something and set it there, because you've got a manel, you don't have a panel. If you're going to be representative of the country that you're in, then do a wee bit of work and try and get, because there are plenty of the women out there who can be on those decision-making fora. In my day, they used to say, we can't find any. You didn't look hard enough. You want to talk about that?
I'm sure you all know this copy of Monica's book, and there are some available this evening, and I can tell you Monica's been more than generous in not only in her comments in the book, but in the finances of it, because all profit from the book goes to one of her great causes.
We have victims of the conflict into Women's Aid.
So there are some copies there. She continually gets people saying, oh, I'm going to take one and I'll send the money to you. If you do take one, give the money to me and I will send it to you.
Okay. Because
Wave is owed a fortune. Again, Monica, can't thank you enough for coming this evening. We've had a whole year of these little talks in celebration of our 150th. My great thanks, of course, to our Parish Pastoral Council as well. And it's a great way to utilise such a wonderful space as this as well, and welcome people to share. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. And can I thank you all? I've just looked at my watch. I can't believe that I've kept you for so long. As my mother would say, you can't say hello in 5 minutes. But I also want to thank Father Stephen. We've been friends forever. And the work that you do, as they say, it's the people that will never get mentioned, or they might just get mentioned in the footnotes, who have really walked the journey of trying to keep this place together.
Well,
so
I've got to say, in some of the questions that were asked, and certainly towards the role of women, that we had a massive breakthrough in our own prison system. First and foremost, she wouldn't be the first Director General, but we have a new Director General. But there was an appointment as a female governor, as the head governor in Maghaberry. That would have been unheard of. Would have been unheard of even to have had a woman in working areas of Maghaberry. So I've noticed that change as well. And I think an awful lot of that has come around because of the challenges of people like yourself and many others around.
And they're from Northern Ireland.
And they're from here. Yes,
we used to have to import them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.